Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're in Daniel chapter 4 this week. Um, I was out last week in Ohio, and so Scott was nice enough to go ahead and fill in. And, we've got 12 weeks or so in a quarter, and Daniel has 12 chapters. And so I didn't really want to, miss a week. And so I asked Scott, hey, would you feel comfortable covering Daniel chapter 3? And he said, yeah. So he covered it last week, and I do have the notes. I still put all my notes together for it. And so when we cover chapter 4 today, I'll email the notes out maybe tomorrow or the day after. It'll be for all 4 chapters of Daniel. So if anyone needs those notes, if you've already sent me your email in the past and I've sent it to you, I have a list on my desktop, so you don't have to ask me again. I'll still send it to you. But if anyone else needs the notes that hasn't given me their email yet, just get with me afterwards and we'll go through that. So Daniel chapter 1, what happened in Daniel chapter 1? The background is they came to Babylon, right? Who brought them there? Who was the ruler of Babylon? Okay, Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And then in chapter 1 is where he refused to eat the king's meat. And what happened to him? They were healthy. And they ended up being, how many times did the text at the very end of chapter 1 say they were, how many times, better presented or smarter than the other guys? 10 times, right? In chapter 2, what happened? Nebuchadnezzar had a what? A dream, and he told all the wise men, you tell me what I dreamed and what it meant, or else I'm going to do what? Kill you. And they said, well, you tell us the dream, we'll tell you what it means. Right? And what did Nebuchadnezzar say? No, of course I can tell you my dream, and you can tell me what it means, right? Even if you're wrong. So Daniel interprets the dream, and he gets what? Gets promoted, right? In Daniel chapter 3, last week, Scott taught, what happened? The image, that's right. There was a statue, it was 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. I don't know, did he show you the images last week? Did he show you some pictures on a PowerPoint? Yeah? That's all right. You're probably busy working, don't worry. So if you go and look, for instance, has anyone ever been to Nashville? They have the Parthenon, like the replica of the Parthenon. Jamie and I went to that a few years ago. And the statue was massive, right? It was only 40 feet tall. There's other statues in the U.S. that are the same size. I think the Statue of Liberty is only like 151 feet tall, but it's only like 100 and some foot platform, right? So this statue that Nebuchadnezzar built was 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. Some of the old texts say it could have been like an obelisk, right? Some people think it was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, or some people think it may have been a statue to his god, right? What do you think is one possible reason he built the giant gold statue? That something happened previously? Yeah, there was a dream about this giant statue, and he was told he's the head of what? Gold. So whether it was a statue to him, whether it was a statue to one of his gods, or whether it was just like an obelisk, either way, it was 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, and they told that whenever you heard the sound of the instruments, what did you have to do? Bow down to it, or else what? You're going to be thrown in the fire, right? And so the 3 guys who didn't bow down, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is what we know them by. That's their Babylonian slave names. They're Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, or their Jewish names. What did they say to Nebuchadnezzar? We're not going to bow down. I think it's funny when you look at what they said. They actually said, look, we don't even need to answer you in this matter, right? Do you think they made that decision to obey God right then? When do you think they'd already made it? Long time ago. I was talking with Scott at GBN one day about character, and we were just talking about making decisions, do the right thing. And Scott made a comment that stuck with me, which is pretty much that. Scott said, well, if you just make your mind up, you're always going to do the right thing a long time ago. Then when a situation comes up, your decision's already made, right? And that's what those young boys had done. They had already made their decision that they weren't going to do anything to disobey God while they're in Babylon. And so it says they were going to heat the furnace how many times hotter? 7, okay? And then they take them up, and most of the furnaces back then, all the way back in Genesis, they started working with iron, right? You read through Joshua, the people they were fighting had chariots of iron. So a lot of those old iron forging furnaces looked like a big dome, and they would have like a mound that goes up to the top or steps, and then you would drop the stuff in the top, almost like think of an igloo. If you drop something in the top of an igloo, or like a pizza oven, right? You've been to pizza like Pyros where they have this dome, right? And you can put the pizza in the front. That's likely in a much bigger scale the type of furnace it was. That's why they dropped them in, and Nebuchadnezzar could look in and see what? He saw 3 men, and then he saw what? A fourth, and he says, wait a minute, how many guys did we throw in? 3, and he says, and there's another one in there like unto the son of the gods. Some translations say the son of God. It's probably son of the gods is probably a better translation. So he looks in and he thinks he sees what? Some sort of spiritual being in there with him. And when they came out, their hair was singed, right, and they stank like smoke. No, not even the smell of smoke. That's a miracle, isn't it? You ever been at a bonfire? Did you guys have a bonfire last night after we left? Yeah? Didn't your clothes smell like smoke? Yeah, and they didn't even smell like smoke, right? So then what happens after that? They get what? Promoted again, okay? And that leads us to chapter 4. So in chapter 4, which we're going to be covering today, we don't know how much time has transpired between chapters 3 and chapter 4. Look at Daniel 4:30, though. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 30. Daniel 4:30 says, the king spoke, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and the honor of my majesty? A lot of people think that he's basically looking out over the city and all the things that he had built. So a lot of people think this is probably years later, maybe into his latter years when he had conquered everybody. He wasn't fighting any more wars anymore. Things were pretty peaceful, and he finished a lot of his building projects. As we go through the chapter, we'll talk about some of those building projects, but some of them were considered, some of the 7 wonders of the world back then. He was a pretty impressive builder. So chapter 4 that we're going to try to cover today, this is an edict or a letter to all the people in the Babylonian Empire. Parts of it are in first person by Nebuchadnezzar, and it's basically exalting the God of Daniel, Daniel's God, okay? So it's possible maybe Daniel helped Nebuchadnezzar compose this. There's a lot of things in here that are like direct parallels with the Psalms. You also don't know if Daniel, while he's spending time with Nebuchadnezzar, is trying to do what? Maybe teach him, maybe convert him, right? Nebuchadnezzar had seen lots of miracles already, had he not? Yeah, he saw Daniel interpret his dream. He saw these men in the fire. So it's possible that Daniel was trying to convert him. There's a lot of commentators that think actually at the time of his death, Nebuchadnezzar had been converted because they look at how his son, Marduk, released Jehoiakim, who'd been imprisoned since he was 8 years old maybe. And so he released him and let him sit at the Babylonian king's table after Nebuchadnezzar died. And then he was actually assassinated in Babylonian history. So some people think that the reason he released him is because Nebuchadnezzar had been converted and he wanted to honor his dad's wishes. And then the other people there didn't like it, and so they assassinated his son. So that's just a theory. We really don't know if he was converted or not. But let's go ahead and start reading. Does somebody want to read Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 through 5? Daniel 4, 1 through 5. And I'll read it if someone else won't. Okay, thanks, Tim. So in the first 4 verses and then to verse 5, he talks about his dream. But the first 4 verses, he says, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth. At this time, Babylon's ruling, much of the known world. Massive area from over in what we call Asia all the way over to, Greece and down into North Africa. And so he's sending out this message, and he talks about in verse 2, the signs and wonders that the Most High God's worked for me. We talked about some of those miracles that he'd seen, right? Verse 3, how great are his signs, mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. Does that sound like something a pagan king would write? Not really. To me it doesn't. This is kind of what I think leads some commentators to think, hey, maybe Daniel helped him with this. Remember back in Daniel chapter 2, they talked about the vision, and that rock that was going to come was going to be what? A kingdom that would last for forever. Okay, it's referencing the church. I don't know that, I think sometimes it's easy for us to look, we have a completed New Testament, and look back in the Old Testament and see, oh, this rock was the church, and I think sometimes back then it may have been a little bit harder for them to figure out what all that meant without the interpretations that we have in the New Testament. Verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts on my bed and visions troubled me. So before we go through, I want to give you a summary of this dream. Maybe that way as we go through it, it's easier to understand. So there's going to be this great tree, and for those of you who know the story, what does the tree represent? Nebuchadnezzar, right? So he's going to talk about this great, big, beautiful tree, and all the animals live under it, and it nourishes and protects them. And then as we go through the text, you'll notice, we'll point it out, it's talking about it, him. So it, the tree, him. And it'll be talking about Nebuchadnezzar. So it'll shift right in the middle. And then it talks about this tree, it represents Nebuchadnezzar, is going to be what? Cut down, right? It's going to be cut down, and then there's going to be a band of iron that's placed around it, sort of for protection. It's trying to say, hey, look, the tree's not going to be completely destroyed. And then later, the kingdom is going to be restored to Nebuchadnezzar, right? So that's what the vision is. It's basically this vision telling Nebuchadnezzar, look, you're this mighty tree, you're going to be chopped down, and then one day you're going to look back to God and you're going to be restored, okay? So let's go ahead and move through the text. Any questions or comments so far? Try to do a better job of asking that as we go through. Okay. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 6. Therefore I issued a decree. Who's the I here? Nebuchadnezzar, right? It's first person from Nebuchadnezzar's standpoint right now. Therefore I issued a decree, this is a letter, something he sends out, to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream, right? Now this is sort of similar to Daniel chapter 2, okay? But you're going to notice in this one what happens. Verse 7, then the magicians, astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in. I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. What's the difference in this one between chapter 2? He told them the dream, right? In chapter 2, he wouldn't tell them the dream. Some people think that's because he said, I want to see a real miracle. I want you to tell me what I dreamed last night. Some people think it's because Nebuchadnezzar forgot his dream. That's what Josephus said, some of his writings. Well, okay, so here's my hunch. She said, why did he even call them in again if they couldn't do it in Daniel chapter 2? I wonder if he was basically just testing them all. I wonder if, a lot of time has probably transpired. Maybe he thinks, well, I'll give him a second chance. It's also possible that he thinks Daniel's going to be the only one that can do it anyway, but he's going to give the other guys a chance. You notice at the beginning, Daniel doesn't come at the first. Daniel comes later. Why is that? Maybe Daniel was busy with the king's business. Daniel was what in command to the king? Yeah, it seems to be second command, right? So it's possible that he was doing a lot of things. I mean, I bet you during the course of his life, we don't have a lot of information on this, but I would expect if he's second command to the king, and the king is just lounging in his palace, that Daniel's probably out there doing a lot of his business, Dwayne. Chapter 2. In chapter 2, some versions say that as they began to kill the wise men, Daniel went and said, hey, wait a minute, let me interpret the dream. Some people think that the Hebrew, or no, Aramaic, because it's in chapter 2. Obviously, I don't read Aramaic, but some people say that it means that he was getting ready to start killing them. So I don't know if in chapter 2 some of them had already been killed before Daniel said, no, let me interpret it, or not. I always think it's interesting that these guys who pretty much Daniel saved their life in chapter 2 seem to be, maybe the guys in chapter 3 that want to get the other Jewish boys thrown in a furnace. And then it seems like in this chapter, whether they're the same ones or different ones, I'm not sure. But my guess would be at least some of them are the same. Yeah, Dwayne.
That was kind of my point, whether or not this is in chronological order, and or were these new magicians, or were these the old magicians that got killed yet?
Yeah. My guess would be that if there is a long period of time, as verse 30 talks about, he's looking at all the things he's built. They've archaeologically found, like in the ruins of Babylon, like thousands of bricks, and he had his name printed on every single one of them. And we'll look at some of the other projects as we go through. He built a 400-foot bridge across the Euphrates River. I think we sometimes think back and say, wow, these guys were 500 years before Christ, like they must have taken little boats across. Like they had a 400-foot bridge. He basically built canals through Babylon. so that he diverted this Euphrates River, and it ran through the city, and they had docks for ships to serve as ships. And later, when Babylon, we'll talk about that in chapter 5. Actually, Scott may be covering it. Scott's going to cover the next 2 weeks. But whenever they get the city taken, there's a prophecy of the destruction of Babylon, and I think it's maybe in Ezekiel, I'm not sure. But it talked about how the rivers would be dried up. And you say, what does that mean? But if you look at historically how Babylon was destroyed, is the Medes and the Persians actually built this giant canal and diverted the Euphrates River. Well, the Euphrates River ran under this wall of Babylon. So in chapter 5, when Babylon's having this giant party and everybody's drunk, that's actually the night that they diverted the river, and the Medes and Persians walked under the wall on the dry riverbed, well, wet riverbed, and up in and killed everybody and conquered Babylon. So historically, it's pretty incredible. But when you look through all these things, Nebuchadnezzar was an incredible builder. So I'm sure during that time, he was acquiring new magicians and new sorcerers or whatever. It seems like he had quite a big group. So I'm sure some of them are the same from chapter 2. If they started killing them in chapter 2, then maybe they got to some of them before Daniel saved them all. So good thoughts, good question. All right, so verse 8. But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God, and I told him the dream before him, saying. So obviously he tells these magicians, and they can't do what? Which really just confuses me. If you're these magicians, and you're the same ones from chapter 2, and he says, tell me what the dream means or I'm going to kill you. You know what I'd be doing in chapter 4 when he tells me this dream? Oh, I know exactly what that means. Let me tell you, it's going to happen 10 years in the future, which gives me time to get out of Babylon, right? I don't know, but it says they couldn't tell him the dream. So in chapter 4, he basically is referencing Daniel. This is interesting. It seems to me the first time he actually calls Daniel by his name. But then he says, oh, his name's Belteshazzar, by the way. Okay? Daniel, if you remember from chapter 1, means God has judged his life. And in chapter 1, when they brought him to Babylon, they changed their names. Why? They wanted to get the Israel out of them. They wanted to get the Jehovah Yahweh out of them, right? So they changed his name from Daniel to God has judged his life to Belteshazzar, which means protect his life, right? Okay, chapter 4 and verse 9. Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know the spirit of the holy God is in you and no secret troubles you, explain to me the visions of my dream that I've seen in its interpretation. These were the visions of my head while on my bed. So he's going to tell him what the dream was now. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Is this a literal tree? No, it's figurative. Yeah, it's a dream. He says this tree can be seen by all to the ends of the earth, right? But you can see the picture he's painting, all right? Verse 12, its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found some shade under it. The birds of the heaven dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. So it provides for the whole world, okay? Verse 13, I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. I'll have to add this to my notes. I don't have it in here, but some of the, this is in what language? We're between chapters 2 and 7. It's not in Hebrew. It's in Aramaic, okay, which is similar to Hebrew. In some of the early, like 200 BC, before Jesus to the time of Christ, there was a lot of these apocryphal writings, and this term watcher is referencing an angel. Literally, it means, I think, one who sees or one who knows, and it's this idea of eyes. So it's this idea that angels see things, right? If you remember in Ezekiel, remember he sees this vision of these, I think it's Ezekiel's cherubim. I always get cherubim, maybe it's seraphim. I always get them mixed up. But in Ezekiel, he sees this vision, and they have these wheels of eyes that's supposed to represent knowledge, right? So this is an angel, but it's called a watcher in this text. That's what the Aramaic term is for, okay? So it says, I saw in my visions, there was a watcher, okay, a holy one, it's an angel, coming down from heaven. And like an angel is a what? Angel delivers a what? Message. Messenger is what angel means, right? So it says he's going to deliver a message. Verse 14. He cried aloud and said this, chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts go out from it and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze. and the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let, what? What's the next word? Let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. You notice a shift in this verse? Verse 15, let it be wet with the dew of heaven. Talking about what? The tree, it. And then it says, let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth, right? So this is where it transitions from the vision, okay, this is the it to a him. It sort of gives you a hint of the interpretation, all right? Verse 16, let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him, okay? So it's a man, he's going to be changed to a what? An animal, okay, a beast, right? Go to Daniel chapter 7. I want to show you something. No, let's not go there yet. I changed my mind. We're going to go there in a minute. I want to do one more piece of information before we go to chapter 7. Okay, so it's a man changed into a beast. Okay, we're going to see what this means, but technically this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar, how he's going to go a little crazy and start eating grass like an ox. Okay, you're going to see this idea of 7 times, multiple times in this chapter. Some people think it means, well, I'll give you the different explanations. Some people think that it means 7 months, because they say it can't be 7 years, because if it was 7 years, somebody would have usurped his throne, right? Nobody would let the king be crazy for 7 years without making a move. A lot of people, I'd say the majority, think it means 7 years, because 7 times sort of means you'd think 7 years. Also in Babylonian history, extra biblically, his son was Amel Marduk. The Bible calls him Evil Merodach. Evil doesn't mean he was evil, it's just the Hebrew translation, right? But they say that in the Babylonian records, his son, while he was crazy, took the throne and ruled for him. And then once he regained his consciousness, he came back and threw his son into prison. And then he regained the throne, right? That's one of the Jewish legends, okay? So there's different thoughts. But for the sake of it, we're going to say 7 years is one possibility. That's what some of the other ancient Josephus, some of the Jewish writers thought. Some people think 7 is, in apocalyptic literature, 7 represents what? Like in the book of Revelation, 7 represents perfection, fullness, completion. So some people say, look, this isn't a literal 7 years or 7 months. It just means a complete time. God's going to have him turn into a beast until he learns his lesson, right? 7 is complete. That's why throughout the Bible, if you see 3.5 years or a time, a times, and half a time, 3.5, 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years, that sort of thing. So some people think this 7 is just a complete period of time, okay? Let's look at verse 17. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. This might be one of the key verses of the whole book, in all honesty. Throughout the book, you see that who is in charge of nations and rulers and kingdoms? God is, right? And God can do what to someone who's proud and arrogant? Take him down, right? Here in verse 17? Yeah, this is in verse 17. He's explaining, no, sorry, this is Daniel, I believe. Let's see, tender grass the field. Yeah, so that's there's a lot of things throughout this, literally like direct quotations from the Psalms, which leads people to believe, okay, even though most of it is written in first person, right? So if you look at verse 18, look at this. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. So who's still speaking? But it sure sounds like, who does it sound like would be writing this? Daniel. This is why people think, okay, Nebuchadnezzar wrote this. Have you ever, okay, let's think about this. John, have we ever composed something together? Right? Sometimes John and I have been writing something for GBN, like we write a letter to somebody, and so like he'll write a part, and then I'll write a part, and then at the end we'll put what? Both our names, right? I mean, Don's the director. There's been times where we've written something up and then Don will sign it, or all 3 of us will sign it, right? So it's possible that what happens here is Nebuchadnezzar wants to write this edict, and his right-hand man is who? Daniel. And he's writing it after the time of what happened. He wants to tell the story to everybody. And so he's having Daniel go through it with him, right? It's also very possible that Daniel wrote it in from his experience with Nebuchadnezzar. But either way, it's being written through what? Starts with an I. Inspiration, right? It's written through inspiration, yeah. Okay, so the point I was making a minute ago, he gives it to whomever he will. He sets over at the lowliest of men, right? God needs the big name people in his church, right? No. What happens if I get arrogant? If I get prideful? What will God do? He'll take care of it. He'll quiet me down, right? We got to remember, me included and everyone else, that God doesn't need each one of us, right? He wants to use us for his purposes, but does he need me? He could raise up somebody just as easily, right? Does he need any one of us? No, Acts 17, it says God doesn't need man's hands to worship him, right? So just like this back then, Nebuchadnezzar is what? The ruler of the whole world. And God says what? I can take it away. That's right. I think of King Saul. Let's look at an example in the Old Testament. King Saul, what was the end of his reign? Good or bad? Bad, right? He raised up, he starts offering sacrifices, doing things God told him not to do, and God says, I'm taking the kingdom from you, right? At that time, is Israel a big, giant, powerful nation? Yeah, I think sometimes we think of Israel now and how they're a really small country, and we forget that back in the day, they used to be, the big name in the area, right? They, defeat all these other nations. Go to 1 Samuel 9:21. Somebody wants to read that. Someone look up 1 Samuel 9:21. Someone else look up 1 Samuel 16, 5 through 12. That's a longer one. I won't make you read the whole thing. Whenever someone gets 1 Samuel 9:21, read that. And this is Saul. This is King Saul before he's made king. Listen to his attitude, right? So he goes someone's come to make him king, and he says, why are you making me king? I'm of the smallest tribe of Benjamin, who was almost wiped out, maybe down to 600 men earlier in the Old Testament. He says, I'm from the smallest tribe, and of that small tribe, my family is the what? Least. Why are you talking to me about becoming king? Does it sound like he had a fairly humble attitude? He didn't say like, yeah, I've been waiting for this. I knew someone was going to come make me king. And yet what happens over time? Yeah, he becomes arrogant. He's given power. A lot of times power corrupts people, right? Look in 1 Samuel chapter 16. This is how David started out. Now, David was a man after God's own heart. You notice that you normally see that before he does things like the situation with Bathsheba. God did not say when he was committing adultery with Bathsheba and murder, oh, that guy's a man after my own heart. Not then, okay? But if you look in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verses 5 through 12, let's summarize. You have someone, the Lord's coming to Samuel, and Samuel's going to go and anoint the next what? The next king. Look at verse 6. So it was when they came, he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. So he looks at these David's brothers and sees this probably big, tall, handsome, warrior-looking one, and he says what? This is the guy. This is definitely the guy God's going to make king, right? Verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the what? Looks at the heart. So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And they go through all of the sons, and then he basically says, hey, where are all your young men here? And he's like, oh, there's one guy that's what? Keeping the sheep out in the field. David, that's the one I want to make king, right? So what you see in Daniel is that Nebuchadnezzar needs to get this message that God can take care of anybody, right? God is the one that rules, okay? He can raise up whoever he wants. If someone's raised up and then they start to develop arrogance or they don't do what God wants them to do, God can do what? He can remove them. All right, let's go to verse 18. Any comments, questions? Okay. Daniel 4:18. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, and Belteshazzar is who? Daniel, that's right. Declare its interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me its interpretation, but you are able, for the Spirit of the Holy God is in you. So it sounds like he's got some confidence in Daniel, right? Verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished. This word can mean distressed. Imagine, I would think at this time Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar have sort of developed a pretty close friendship, right? So imagine you're Daniel and you're supposed to interpret this dream, and the first dream was it good or bad for Nebuchadnezzar? It was good. Hey, this beautiful head of gold, that's you. Any king would like to hear that message, right? But this message is a little bit different. And so Daniel is standing before a man who he's probably developed a relationship with, but the guy could still turn on him, right? And do what to him if he didn't like what he said? Yeah, this again shows you the character of Daniel. He's not going to lie or cheat or steal to save his life. But he says this, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. And Belteshazzar, Daniel, answered and said, my lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. Some people think that means he's saying, hey, look, this dream's bad for you, it's good for your enemies. And some people think that he's saying, I really wish this was concerning your enemies. Like, I really wish this dream was about somebody else and not you. Verse 20. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, which could be seen by all the earth. Verse 21. Whose leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and those in whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home. This is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth, right? So he's saying, you're this beautiful tree that's basically providing for and ruling the world. Verse 23, and inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him. O king, this is the interpretation. This is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen. You shall be wet with the dew of the heavens, and 7 times shall pass over you, until, here's the key when he's going to get his mind back, you know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses. Verse 26, inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. So he says, you're going to be cast out, you're going to become like this animal, and then whenever you look to heaven and realize that God rules in the kingdom of men, it's going to be what? Restored to you, okay? Verse 27, therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Now think about this. Sometimes we read it and say, oh, I would do the same thing if I'm in front of this king, right? It's kind of like Mark 6, when John the Baptist goes before Herod, who's in an adulterous relationship. Well, what do you think most people today, if they got to preach to Herod, would preach to him about? Anything but the one thing that could get your head chopped off, right? And yet, what did John do? It's like if I got to preach to a president who was in an adulterous marriage, John the Baptist, what would he do? He'd tell him about it, right? Yeah, Linda. Mm-hmm. 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 Huh. Really?
That's what he said. I don't know where, it's a bishop in the United States, but that's what he said. Where are the John the Baptist today that will preach to the Herods? That's what he said.
That's a good quote. She said that there was, I think it was a Catholic bishop that was referencing, the president and abortion and Catholicism, and said, where are the John the Baptist today that will preach to the Herods? That's interesting. That's a good quote. Yeah, so you have the boldness of John the Baptist, right? And you've got Daniel, who basically, after he says, hey, this tree that's going to be chopped down is you, and then he says, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Listen to what he says. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. How many people do you think in Babylon would say this sort of thing to the king? Maybe there's others, but my guess is Daniel's probably the only one, which maybe is why the king liked him so much. Maybe the king, I don't know. I mean, I think there are sometimes people who are in positions of power that like people that treat them regularly, but then you just hope that they don't turn on you in a moment where they want you to agree with them, right? So Daniel is pretty brave, he's pretty wise, and he tells the king, look, king, please repent. This maybe is a point to why he cares about him. If he didn't like him, I don't know, if it was a king I didn't like, maybe, I don't know if I'd tell him that or not, right? But Daniel says, look, break off your sins, repent, treat the poor and the needy right, and maybe God will lengthen your prosperity. Verse. Mhm. 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 Yeah. It's interesting. If you read through Daniel on your own, it seems like whenever Nebuchadnezzar sees the miracles that are done before him, he recognizes Daniel's God as a God, but then throughout the book, he'll still reference, your God, your God is the God of the gods. He'll still reference multiple gods. So it doesn't seem like he's yet been brought to this idea that Yahweh is the one true God and all others are fakes. It seems like he's brought to this idea that, yes, Yahweh is a powerful God, maybe the most powerful, but there are still others, right? So even though he recognizes this, Daniel is still trying to teach him and encourage him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So verse 28, it says, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 29. So it's a year later, right? So he's had a year to do what? To think about it, to follow what Daniel said, which is repent. He's basically had a year to do what Daniel said. The Bible says God is impatient, right? God is long-suffering, right? He wants all men to come to knowledge of the truth and repent, right? So God's patient. Even with Nebuchadnezzar, he gives him a year, okay? At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, is this not great Babylon that I built for myself and a royal dwelling by my mighty power and the honor of my majesty? Notice the focus there. It says, I, my. And we'd say, well, this is sort of prideful and arrogant. It is. In Isaiah 13 and 14, it even talks about one of the reasons Babylon will be brought down is because of its arrogance. But historically, this is some facts I have. Nebuchadnezzar was not just known for being a warrior, but a great builder. He built canals, like we talked about, so the river Euphrates ran through the city of Babylon. He built docks to service ships and to take passengers to different places. He built a 400-foot-long bridge across the river connecting eastern and western Babylon. Euphrates is not like a little creek, right? I mean, you see like a giant bridge across the Mississippi, and you're like, wow, it's pretty impressive, right? And we have giant steel beams and cranes, and what did he have back then? I'm sure he actually had some sort of machinery, but I don't know that he had what we have today. He built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. He actually did that for his wife, who was from Medo-Persia up in the mountains. And so Babylon is flat, and so she missed the mountains, and he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to build you this giant mountain that you could actually see from outside the walls of Babylon, which were like 50, 60 feet high, right? So it was this giant, beautiful hanging gardens that he built. The outer wall of the city was 17 miles long. It was 40 feet high, and it was 25 feet thick. It was wide enough for chariots to drive past each other on top of the wall, right? So it's not like this guy wasn't actually a good builder. There's times where I could see him saying, man, look at all this that I've done, right? And yet, what does God consider that? Arrogant, yeah. Me personally, just being honest, there's times where I sit there and think, man, look at all this stuff we've done by our hard work, right? And I got to catch myself because guess what? Is that not what he said? Did he work hard to build all that stuff? His slaves probably did, right? You can say?
Reminds me of Solomon saying, look what all I've done, and then, but all this is vanity.
Yeah. And did Solomon did do a lot. Nebuchadnezzar did do a lot. But the problem is he forgot who gave him the what? The power, the opportunity, the placement. I mean, it's like if a guy is like let's say you're a stockbroker and you're managing $1 million accounts and you make some really good calls, it'd be easy to say like, man, look at me, I'm good, right? Look at all this money I made. And in a sense, did you have a part in it? Yeah. But guess who gave you the knowledge, the skill, the opportunity, the upbringing, right? God did. The life, that's right. Your breath to even do it, that's right. So we got to keep God in our thoughts. All right, we got about 5 minutes, so let's move. We're probably not going to get all the way through, but let's see what we can do. Verse 31, while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. They will drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You will eat grass like an oxen until 7 times pass over you. And you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and he gives it to whomever he chooses. That hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heavens, and his hair was grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. This is actually a known psychiatric condition called boanthropy. Lycanthropy, lichen means wolf, so lycanthropy applies to people thinking they're wolves, but also other animals. So lycanthropy is like the bigger group, and then boanthropy is under it. And so there's actually a condition that didn't just happen back then. Nebuchadnezzar is the most well-known example of this, even in like psychiatric, like the American Psychiatric Association or something like that. So this is not something that's unknown to psychiatry. There's actually a story, I have it in my notes. In 46, there was a man in Britain who had this disorder at a mental hospital, and so every day they'd let him outside, and he would go and he would eat grass, and he would drink water. And they gave him a clean bowl of water so he wouldn't drink from the dirty mud puddles, right? And they actually said, the guy that saw it with his own two eyes said, the only physical abnormality he had consisted of a lengthening of his hair and a coarse, thickened condition of his fingernails, which is interesting because that's what the two things that are given to describe Nebuchadnezzar are, right? So this isn't just something that only happened to Nebuchadnezzar. It's something that's happened over time. It's a mental disorder, right? In Daniel chapter 7, there's going to be a description. We don't have time to go over there, but a description that we'll cover when we get to speaking of a vision of this beast, the Babylon, and it uses those two characteristics to sort of give you a heads up. This is who it's referencing, right? Verse 34. At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. So once he looked where? It didn't mean he just looked up, right? It's this idea of saying, hey, he finally gave in and looked to God. His understanding returned, and he blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is a generation, from generation to generation. I've got a lot more notes on this that we're just going to skip, but if you want the notes, you can read through them. I have a lot of Psalms that you can compare this section to. It's like either Nebuchadnezzar had been taught the Psalms, or Daniel had taught him the Psalms, and Nebuchadnezzar's like, oh yeah, put that one in there, right? Put this one in there. Because it's like parallels with the Psalms, which were written before or after? Before. The Psalms were written before. This was written after the Psalms, right? I've got a lot of notes on the Dead Sea Scrolls that reference the tradition of his son and what happened after he died. Verse 35, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth no one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom my honor and splendor was returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me, and I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride, he is able to what? Put down. He says, I was the ruler of the world, and I got prideful, and what happened? God put me down, right? So I have a lot of notes in there about some different historical things, but the gist of this chapter is what we've said multiple times. It doesn't matter who you are. If you get arrogant, if you start to forget God, what can God do? Bring you down, right? And that applies to everybody, right? There's no exceptions. The king of the world, right? You can even look at God's own people. So next week, I'm going to be somewhere, I forget, somewhere in Tennessee, and I'll be somewhere else in Tennessee the week after that. Scott's going to cover the next 2 weeks. Chronologically, chapter 5, or in the text, chapter 5 comes next, and that's the destruction of Babylon. But some chapters later in the book actually happen in the reign before Babylon is destroyed. I'm going to talk to Scott, see what chapters he wants to cover. But next week, he'll either cover chapter 5, where Babylon is destroyed, where the Persians rerouted the river and came under while they were having a party, or he'll cover later chronologically. I want to see what he wants to do, chapters he'd prefer to teach. But once again, if you have any notes, if you want my notes, get me your email, and I'll get you those notes probably tomorrow or the day after. So, all right, thanks for your attention.